this time we wanted to talk about something else, namely pre-production. This is like the phase that a lot of studios tend to kind of skip or not pay too much attention to, or maybe not pay attention to the right things. So they fall in the cracks of missing out on a lot of things that could help them succeed or help them learn how and why they would succeed. With Codecks, you especially had a lot of experience seeing how a lot of different studios are setting up their projects, how they figure out how to scope, how to forecast, especially like how to deal with later stages. And this is something that is also very tricky when it comes to the tooling that exists already or that are used in the industry, because they're not designed to support stages, whereas Codecks is, but it's another thing to point out. But I would love to, in this video, kind of go a bit deeper into how pre-production is being set up. What are the things that studios maybe are missing or maybe are doing good as well? What can we learn in that area? And how can we use those learnings to actually build up a forecasting for a game that would then later in the phase of building or phase of production would help make the success level maybe higher. All right.
Sounds good.
So let's do question number 1. What makes pre-production in itself a distinct phase? Can we go from there?
Yes. So, and I agree. Or just to reiterate on that, in game dev, you have different stages, and that's similar to maybe also the movie industry and so on. And the pre-production is is its own stage, and the type of questions or the goal of each stage is a bit different. And the goal of the pre-production stage is removing uncertainty about the product and about the product that you're building and the process you're building it in. So what you're trying to answer during pre-production is, I mean, obviously what the game is, where the fun is and so on, but also then specifically how you're going to surface that fun. What is specifically the scope of your game? And how will you be able to create that scope? And if you can find the answer to these questions, you can build an idea how many resources you need, what is realistic. You can create an idea about how your production stage will look like. How you do that specifically in the pre-production stage is usually by building a vertical slice. So a vertical slice is I think most people are probably familiar, but it's like when you have like a cake and you slice it from top to bottom, you will get a piece or a layer of a taste of every layer in the cake. So, right. So it's, if you want to sample a cake and get a taste of it, it's better to taste it by creating a vertical slice instead of like a horizontal slice where you would just get the strawberry layer and just the cake layer and so on. So similarly, we create a vertical slice where we have a bit of everything in there. And this is not just for surfacing fun, because you can find the fun in prototypes as well. This is specifically about having an idea about how to create these assets that you will require. How long does it take to create, for example, one level in pretty much final quality? And then that information will help you guide you towards understanding your process, your pipeline, how long it takes. And then that again will help you understand how much overall scope you can manage.
So you already hinted a bit towards the direction of, like, in pre-production, the point is not only to come to a prototype or a vertical slice and to figure out kind of what's fun, but to actually figure out, what is it that you need to build, in which phase, how long that will take, how much you need to invest, and so forth. Why is this something that studios tend to skip or underinvest in?
I think in the reality of in the games industry business, there are just so many factors that can disrupt this these ideal stages. Like when you run a studio, like I've been doing for a couple of years, you will realize that, especially as the team grows, just the complexity of managing all the budgets and resources that you have grows. If you're a single game or single project studio, the deal flow of acquiring a publishing contract can take usually around 6 months. So you have to already half a year before the game ends, you would need to start the publishing scouting process. For that, you then need half a year ahead of that, at least for like pre-production and figuring out what you're actually pitching and so on. So you need the right amount, the right people for prototyping, for figuring out that vertical pipeline, but they might be busy in another project at that time. So you have to like find a good cadence of like on-ramping, off-ramping people and so on. There's that. And then, the other way around as well. For example, you budget, maybe I go to a publisher. I've prototyped an idea very roughly. I can get a publisher interest. I sell the product, or I sell them on a 2-year development timeline with half a year of pre-production. So the half a year passes on pre-production, but we figure out that we need more time. There's like, after half a year, that not all the answers have been, or not all the questions have been answered, or they have been answered in a way that shows like, oh, it's not possible like this, right? So what do you do at that point? You're already in a contract. You are already tied to a budget. Maybe you have like grant requirements that require you to get started. You already have started your hiring on ramp and so on. So you would have to stop all of that machine, kind of delay it, add more iterations on pre-production and so on. And that's the problem. So there's not just the problem of you don't have enough resources. There's also the problem of having too many resources and having a staff that you want to occupy. And it's kind of there's this terminology of like feeding the beast, right? When you have like you have a big team or some team, and they are asking you, well, what should we do? And you feel inclined to cut it short and like, okay, we're not entirely sure about the pre-production, but we need to get started. Like we need to start working on assets. And that's the kind of the reality, or what makes game dev so unbelievably complex. But obviously it's very risky approaching it this way. I've seen many projects fail due to it, and what happens is a lot of work being thrown away, levels being built before even like the player abilities have been fleshed out, things changing, and in the worst case, then whole projects getting cancelled or just not being at the quality they could be.
So the theory is there. Like we know, your success level is probably there if you invest more time in setting up your pre-production, right? But how does it look like in practice? How do you translate pre-production learnings into a forecast that can help you in the next steps?
So what I would recommend people to do is create a vertical slice, like we discussed, because there's a big difference between something like, we figured it out, we do that later and so on. Like that pipeline, we'll do that later and so on, and really actually doing it and realizing. I mean, most often it turns out that things are much more complicated than we thought, right? Like an animation or a custom rig or something per character where it's like, how bad could it be? It turns out usually it's much worse than you thought. So it's really important to do the vertical slice at a almost final quality level. So that really gives you the idea. So when you do that and you have something of everything, kind of like you have at least one enemy and one character and one level or race car or whatever it is, this will give you the pipeline per each of these entity types. And then if you calculate those, the very basic idea is something like, okay, for a weapon, we need 1 week between a artist and a programmer. And then for a character, for a level, we need like 8 weeks, and so on. For a character, we need 3 weeks between these people and so on. So if you manage to collect these process details, then it's just math. You can just calculate backwards. You have like 18 months of production. That means you can do, I don't know, 12 levels, 10 characters, 14 items, and so on. And if you collect this information by work area, you can really start to play around with the different requirements that you have across departments also. And you can start getting into, maybe you need outsourcing help, or you need to ramp up and ramp down at some point during production and so on. But it's really, in the end, you're kind of like building during pre-production, you're figuring out what factory to build and building the factory. And during production, it's just like using the factory to churn out content. And that you can simply calculate if you start tracking your progress.
Even like very experienced teams tend to struggle with this, so it's not just like small starting out studios. What helps to make this process a bit more clean versus keeping it as chaotic as it can be?
I mean, on one hand, even big studios struggle with it because I think it's pretty hard. Even in an idealistic view, you would have like very clear pre-production, production stages and so on. And during pre-production, you would just explore, and during production, you wouldn't explore anymore, and you would just do the stuff. In most game productions, that's not how it works, right? You should still have these different stages, but sometimes just because you go into production doesn't mean that the whole exploration stuff shuts down and so on. Probably you will have kind of like a hybrid model where with different work areas working more like in a Kanban style, where they really iterate on or like work through a backlog quickly. Other parts of your game studio might still work more iteratively, like more Scrum inspired. But coming back to your question, how to do that, how to approach that. I think the really basic idea is to organize your backlog and your project setup similar to your game. So to think of your backlog in terms of a game entity representation. Like when I think about my game, and also the players think about your game, you would probably think about, I have characters here, I have levels, I have items, and so on. So I think that's the very basic thing, is to break down your game in those terms, in these entity types. Because most teams kind of struggle with that, or they create ticket after ticket after ticket, but those tickets are not really connected. They're like what I call like a sea of tickets or a forest of tickets, and it's hard to see the game behind all those tickets, understanding the model that you're trying to do. And that's, I think, the first step, is setting up your project in a way that mirrors the entities and the game that people will perceive. And then if you start doing that, then you can start tracking time and effort per each of these entities. And you can start thinking about the pipeline and so on. But if you don't do that, if you don't set up your project from the start in this way, it's going to be very hard to retroactively get to that conclusion.
If you're like starting out and don't have that much experience to benchmark kind of your forecasting, how do you assess, or how do you figure out how much time and how many resources should be placed in which area?
I mean, if you have no idea, I would just probably estimate it and just guess. I don't know if you can really benchmark it, because every team is so different, and the art pipeline is different, and the experience level is different. Again, I would probably come back to creating a vertical slice, creating a good choice for vertical slice, and working from there. And they're different. Also, even within vertical slices, there are different approaches you can take. There's also this terminology of like a beautiful corner, which is like the idea that within a level, maybe it's even too much to create a full level in vertical slice quality. So you could even focus on just creating like one corner of it, like one screenshot, where if you wouldn't move the camera in the first person shoot, then you would know, okay, I'm gonna look in this specific corner, and that just this one screenshot that I take, that looks final quality art style. Even having those few assets in the screen at final quality can help you a lot in gathering data. So Yeah, whether it's your inexperienced or experienced team, I think it all comes down to trying to get real data as quickly as possible. And for that, you have to have some idea about the game, of course. You have to have you have to know kind of what art style you're aiming for and so on. But also vertical slices force you to make those decisions. So that's another reason why they're good.
So once production is running, right? What should teams be measuring to understand whether their forecast is actually holding up?
It can be as simple as tracking time, tracking the hours. Some teams like to use time tracking within their tool or within their project management tool or in a separate tool and so on. So you can track hours, for example. I personally think that requires a lot of discipline. So to me, I think it's easier, but also still accurate enough to have, for example, if you have a bi-weekly sprint or something, just measuring the amount of assets you can do in that time and so on. You have to track the completion rate and the number of assets that have been completed in a certain time. Whether that time is like within 1 hour or 1 week or 2 weeks doesn't really matter, but you should track it somehow and then continuously update your scope estimates and so on, right? This is not something you do once and then you are done forever. This is something you should be tracking continuously, and there will be things that still where you're getting delayed, where you have to most likely cut down scope further as you go through the project, and that there it's useful, of course, to already have an idea of kind of what the priorities of your content are and what is more cuttable than other things, like what is more deeply integrated into the rest of the game and so on.
How far should you just rely on data or make sure that you're tracking everything versus when are the situations where you can also rely maybe on your gut feeling, or is that something you should even do?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think generally there's a sweet spot between how much planning you want to do and how much you're getting out of it. I don't think like more planning is always better. There's like there's a point where planning and tracking and so on becomes like so tedious and it can be so much busy work that it's not worth it anymore. So I think it's a good idea to keep it at a reasonable level. And it's fine to apply estimates and to intuition there, but you need to constantly validate as you go. Kind of, are we still on track? Does this seem reasonable? If you've planned to do within a year like 30 levels, and then after 1 month you realize we have done 1 level only so far, then you either need to come up with ways to improve your pipeline to the level that you can do more, or you just have to cut back, Yeah.
And I guess the more you go through the process, the more you understand what's needed. So it's kind of a bit easier to assess and implement changes.
Yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, you become a expert in making your game by the time it's done. When it's too late, kind of when you wish you could go back and do it proper this time. There's always a bit of uncertainty. But if you use the pre-production stage well, your aim should be to remove or reduce as much of that uncertainty as possible. If you don't use it well, you go from pre-production, you enter the production state with a lot of uncertainty, with a lot of lack of process understanding, which results in constant reworking and so on, and which results in a lot of wasted resources. Because having a good understanding of your scope and being able to estimate something, it's not about what is even the point of knowing how much you will be doing at the end, right? Somebody could say like, well, I don't want to know, like just surprise me. I will just have as many levels as I can.
Yeah.
And then, what's the point of even planning, right? And the answer to that for me is it's similar to if you would be building a house and you would buy all the material and the wood and the concrete and I don't know, the stone and so on, and you don't even know what kind of, like how many stories your house should have, what the function should be. Should it have a garage or a pool, or I don't know, let's just get started. And what will end up happening is probably at the end of the construction, if you manage to build the house, you will sit on a lot of resources that are unused, or you will notice that resources were missing that you needed. right? And that's kind of what happens with planning in games. If you don't know how many animation resources you need and so on, you cannot hire like an animator to fill that position or that need with enough time. If you need voiceover and so on, if you need localization, all of these things need time for setting them up right. And if you don't have an idea of how much resources you will need and so on, you're just setting up yourself for like wasting a lot of resources. The worst thing is wasting resources that could have gone to like some area where they could have made a difference. But instead you might end up with halfway finished. Instead of like 5 awesome levels, you might end up with 5 features where you had to cut like 5 levels where you had to cut 5 other levels because they were at the end of production only halfway done. And so you had to throw them away anyway. And then the other ones, they are also not awesome because you spread your resources thin and so on. I think planning is really important. Is the short version. Got a bit in a rant. But I think, yeah, there's like a lot of pain you can take on from not planning ahead.
It's also interesting because, like, of course, planning is super important. Like, it teaches you so much on how to be more precise with the decisions you're making, how to be more efficient, more time and on budget. And as you said, like, you get to a point where you learn how to make your game at the end of the game, and then you decide to make your second game, and then you think you've learned, but then it feels like the process is not completely, but there's so much difference. Why is it that you cannot just replicate your success?
Maybe you could, but I guess just the player expectations change, right? So you could, if you do a sequel and it's the same as the first game, exactly, people will just, people don't tend to appreciate that. So what you will be doing is your first game had like 2D pixel art, then the next one is art style, then the next one is like, oh, we have to do first person 3D thing to elevate it and so on. And so you set yourself higher goals for every single thing, and then you unlearn all the things you learned before, which is a problem.
All right, so this is a question we touched upon a bit in the last video, but I wanted to elaborate a bit more on it. Every studio seems to try and figure out how to do production in their own way because we don't really have a framework that's established industry-wide. We also don't have specific tooling that's really designed for games. Everybody kind of tries to build things internally with what they have and what they have learned. Do you actually think that the games industry is getting better as time goes by with production management, or are teams just like getting better at surviving sort of what is already established?
I think teams are definitely getting better at using the tech. These game engines are getting so much more powerful. So they have more and more allow fewer people to create more. So to a certain degree, maybe we are outrunning production problems. But generally, I think there's a lack of like we talked about last time. There's a lack of process awareness, process, and so on. There are a couple of people that are trying to change that, or voices within this industry that are sharing best practices about production. But there's Clinton Keith talking a lot about agile, and there's also playful game productions, which combines game design and process management and so on. So we have a couple of voices, but I think overall we could be doing more as an industry. There hasn't been enough movement in that direction. And I think the very first step in how we can get better there is starting to establish terminology in this area. Because as long as we don't have terminology or words for the best practice that all of these studios are actually already doing, but having no way of talking about it and educating each other and like sharing best practices and giving talks about it and so on. So I think that's one of the very first steps we need to do as an industry, or get better at learning and how to talk about these best practices, which game studios have discovered organically, right? And I think that's also one of the, or I know this is one of the big ideas or motivations between kind of our initiative of talking about scope-driven productions and SDP. The idea is to give some of these principles, which successful game studios are already using a terminology, and collecting them so that we can educate people, that we can embrace these ideas.
Framework is, of course, like frameworks, methodologies, vocabulary is very important, of course. But another thing that maybe is secondary, but still can kind of help or hinder how studios kind of deal with productions is tooling. And currently, what is used industry-wide are tools that are meant for project management for other industries, and they're taken over by game studios, and yeah, like teams try to just make them work. They're not designed to or based on game stages, especially when we're talking about pre-production, the forecasting. Like you really have to figure out how to build that setup, whether you do it on Excel or you figure out some kind of whiteboard, Miro, integration, Jira, something. Like it is an elaborate thing that you have to first figure out how to do. Where do you think kind of this whole thing, like how far does it hinder teams? Like, is it something that really needs to be thought through? Is there a better way?
Well, obviously people could be using Codecks, where we're trying to solve some of these issues. I think tooling, it's understandable that the tools are maybe not fully serving the game development process, because they have never been designed for this methodology or for this use case. They have templates maybe, and customizable workflows which can be adapted to game development. But there's a big difference between, in my opinion, between customizing like a workflow and then saying like, oh, now it's made for games, right? On one hand, it leaves everybody to figure out the stuff by themselves. I've talked to a lot of also bigger studios recently, and even in AAA, there are studios where they inherit, where this thing has become so cumbersome to manage that they inherit like their project template from generation to generation, like a holy grail or something, where it's like nobody dares to touch it anymore because it's always almost breaking. And I think there's a better way. I think that if you really approach it from how can we make this generic thing kind of like hack some stuff into it for game dev, like what if you completely approach it from taking game dev as the principal lens through which to create this. And just an example of the issues that this creates when you don't have a good tooling, because I feel like you said, I think a lot of producers are helping themselves with Excel and so on. They export the data from their tool, and they load it into like a more powerful table calculation like Excel, and then they start like creating their own formulas and so on, which can be very cumbersome. It's a lot of manual work, exporting, importing, and so on. So that causes a lot of redundancy and so on. There's a big risk of you not using the latest data. Your filter setting is missing some work area and so on. So you wrestle all this, or you wrangle all this data into your Excel. You can do some calculations. It's maybe a bit clunky, cumbersome, and so on. The problem that happens with this whole ordeal is like so complicated and annoying to use, is that you do it less often, right? Something that should be a natural part of your process, where like every week you update your scope, and you update your calculations, and you update the things you know about the pipeline and so on, becomes a thing where it's like, it's too much work. Let's do it once per month, right? let's do it every 8 weeks and so on. And so you lose the ability to course correct in real time. And then you add more friction and delay into your decision process. And this is just one example that then results in potentially worse games, kind of like lower quality, or you're missing milestones and so on. You could probably with any tool do anything, but you wouldn't want to. I mean, you want to use the tool that's best suited, right, for your use case. Will make your game most comfortable, will allow you to create better products, and it will make your process more playful, as it should be. I mean, it's about making games in the end, right?
So what will be a better solution or a better way to deal with the forecasting if Excel is super cumbersome and every other tool doesn't really have the opportunity to have it already sort of preset?
Yeah, that's something we're working on at Codecks, right? Like a forecast idea, because what we have with Codecks, we have a couple of these DSP, SDP, we have a couple of these SDP principles, scope-driven production principles, aligned together in Codecks, and they really allow us to do forecasting, which only works if everything comes together. So what we have in Codecks is we are tracking per work area kind of the velocity of people. So we understand who's in your team and kind of which area they're working on. We understand how the shape of your game, like the game model. Like we understand all the entities that you will have in your game. We understand the UI screens that you will have, the enemies, the systems that you will have in your game, the characters. And then for each of these entity types that have repeatable processes or pipelines, we understand the pipeline. We understand, oh, for this character pipeline, you need these many coding assets, resources, and these many animation resources, and so on. And if you do combine all of these, that's super powerful, because when you combine all of these factors, we know the budget that you need or the resources that you need for your game, and we know the actual team that you have and the velocity in your team. And then if you combine both of these, we can know exactly where the bottleneck is within your project plan. Where do you need more resources? Where do you need to bring on outsourcing or something? Where do you need to scope down? And this is really, I think, to make this convenient, yeah, just all the features have to come together. And they don't in other tools. Usually, I mean, I know of, for example, our pipeline feature or we call it journeys in Codecks. It's so powerful. It's really just how it should be, and how if you create a character and you want it to be like 10 steps and so on, you can set it up perfectly, and you can set up the dependencies and so on. And that's just something that's just not possible in most other tools. Even if you use like plugins and so on. I know people that are using Jira and they are auto tracking they're hacking stuff in where if you make the title of the thing like character and so on, and can create a couple of cards automatically. So that works, but that information, which type of cards and so on, is not available to a forecasting tool, which can read that information, that meta information in, and then calculate forecast from there. And saying like, okay, you need these 10 steps. Well, we need 40 characters, so you need 400 steps, right? And these will be the resources that are attached to those steps and so on. So yeah, in short, like everything has to come to work together, and you can only do that in a tool that's built for a specific purpose. It's really hard for these tools that are general purpose to accomplish all of this, because they have to cater to so many use cases and so many people. It's just an impossible thing to ask from them. So I'm not upset about for them. It's just, yeah, benefit them if you build for a specific target group.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's cool about Codecks and your experience building it, because you focus primarily just on, okay, game studios. That's it. No other industry, no other application for it. And this is something that came out. We've talked with smaller studios, with bigger studios, and everybody struggles with the same thing, zooming in and out, figuring out which resources to allocate where, how to shuffle things around to make sure that you can actually realize your game when you've promised to realize it and within the constraints of your resources. And I mean, this has been a while coming with the forecasting feature, but it's coming out now, so it's super exciting. And I'm very excited to see what people think about it, because it is kind of elevating what you already have with Codecks.
Yeah, I'm also super excited, and people have been curious to see more about it since we announced it, and it really is. It makes me again appreciate the difference between the game production and a general software production, for example. Games are really, I mean, it sounds almost like, well, how different could it be? Like, it's probably just a software process, but they're really, in games, they're like so many special things. For example, in software, you have more one-off systems where you have different features, like an enterprise app, and everything is a one-off system and so on. So, and it's also like a product approach where you are like continuously developing forward and so on. And where you cannot identify pipelines in there, because it's like, oh, we're just like building, we're improving this aspect, and so on. Games is really a weird beast where you identify the need and the assets that you have. You identify the pipelines that you need. You need then a lot of these assets, and you can really forecast into the future. And you also need to, because also in contrast to like something like a website or another app, is that you have to project 18 months in advance or something, that we will land on this point with high quality and with all the levels and so on that we need. And we will need a main menu, and we need like the credit screen and so on. There's really, it's games, I think really are one of the most complex development processes that are out there. And it's weird that we didn't have more game specific creation tools in the project management area, which I think is like one of the most important aspects. I feel a lot of teams don't fail from a lack of talent, but from like specific game projects, they fail from often a lack of planning and a lack of like scope control and so on. So if we can help some more of these games to succeed, I think that's awesome.
Especially now that things are so competitive and the industry is so like having an advantage, it's great. Yeah, you now really need to have your production in check more than ever. Also, it would be so great if there is more of an exchange of best practices, and having something that's already established helps people figure out how to do it even better, I guess. Yeah, I hope so too. I hope we can add some terminology on this, and we can be, I mean, what we're trying to do is like build more than just a tool, right? We're trying to be like part of the community and be also a home for the community. All right. To wrap this up, the forecasting feature is coming out after this video, so not sure when you're watching, but it will be out. Maybe it's already out once people see it. That's true. Sometime in February. Yeah. And there will be a video on how to use it. Yeah, looking forward to what people think, and I think it will change your life. Yeah. Nice. All right, cool. Thank you. Thank you.